I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop. In this video, I'm going to build, paint, and install a glorious fireplace mantle. And building fireplace mantles are some of my most favorite projects because they pack a lot of woodworking into a small project. Adding a variety of moldings, using different router bits, building face frames. These are all details that are fun to build and add to the style of this fireplace mantle. And I get started by building the top. And the top is just two pieces of 3/4 inch MDF laminated together. And I cut a chunk out of the lower piece to reduce weight and also to reduce the total area that needs to be clamped. After cutting the top to its final width, I mark the setbacks where I want the crown molding to land. This then allows me to calculate the position of the legs and then also determine their size. Now that I have the dimensions of the legs, I start by building what I would describe as a face frame, which is just the front surface of the legs. After milling the appropriate amount of lumber, I switch from my 40-tooth all-around blade to my double taper sanding disc. And this disc sands the edge of a workpiece to a perfect 90 degrees, which is great for two reasons. Now the edge of the workpiece is sanded, but it also helps the butt joints of the face frame come together tighter. And if you'd like more information about this disc, I'll have links in the description below. Next, I cut the rails to length with the sanded edge facing forward so there's no blowout. And I do it in this order because it would be difficult to sand the edge of that narrow piece. There's always a little on-the-fly design work with a project like this, so I have all the moldings laid out and I'm making sure everything looks good to my eye. The mighty pocket screw and glue is my preferred method for building face frames. I think the glue is extremely important. That seam will open up over time if glue isn't applied to the joint. With the faces of each of the legs built, standing by and awaiting orders, I cut out the sides of the legs. The Mighty Biscuit joiner makes quick work of the joinery, and I decided to add a couple of extra slots, more than I normally would because the piece of MDF that I had been leaning against a wall and had a lovely bow in it. So the biscuits will help straighten that out. After I was happy with the dry fitting, I glued everything together. Anytime I'm gluing something like this together, I use these clamping squares that I made, and this just makes sure that everything comes together at a 90-degree angle. I add a 1/4 inch backer panel with some glue and nails, and I use just exactly the right amount of glue, not a drop too much. Here's a look at the finished result, and later in the video I'm going to apply this molding around the inside perimeter of this recessed panel. Moving along, the next step is to build this thingy here. I guess it's a surface for the crown molding to land on. And while I'm at it, using the exact same techniques, I build what I like to call the shoes, and these are just essentially a very tall baseboard. The Shapa princess has figured out how to run, and now that's her major mode of transportation these days. At this point, we are cooking with gas. The next step is to build the structure that goes between the two legs. And no, I'm not talking to my volleyball named Wilson. I have a buddy in the shop with me who I'm chatting with. Earlier in the video, when I cut the sides for the legs, I intentionally left them long, and I come back and cut these later on after the legs are assembled. And I like to do it this way because it gives me a little bit of flexibility in that setback where the crown molding lands on the bottom side of the top. Time for pro tip. I like to use a flush trim bit with a V-groove anytime I have a butt joint in MDF. This creates an intentional break versus the line in the paint that will inevitably occur. After lots of screwing and much gluing, this thing is starting to fulfill its destiny and become a fireplace mantle. This little itty bitty teeny weeny guy has a 3/32 inch radius. It gets added to the bottom of the top and the top edges of the shoes. At this point, the structures are built, the hard work has been done. Now it's time to move on to the fun stuff of installing a bunch of different moldings. So this piece gets installed with biscuits because some other stuff is going to attach to it later, if that makes sense. And I want the connection between this piece of molding and the mantle itself to be good and strong. Using size 0 biscuits, and while their name implies they are worth nothing, they're #1 in my heart. The other side benefit of using biscuits to install moldings like this is you can put the piece in place and it will stay firm without having to nail or glue it. Sometimes when marking moldings, the mark ends up in the wrong place on the molding where you can't see it when it's up on the saw. So I like to bring that mark around with a small square. Here's a trick I use to accurately and quickly cut directly to my pencil line versus the cut and scoot method that so many people seem to use. I sight through the louvers in the blade guard right down the plate of the saw blade, and I line that up with my pencil mark, and I account for just an ever so slight offset of the tooth of the saw blade, and I make my cut. This trick is especially helpful when you can't touch the saw blade down to a pencil mark on a workpiece, as is often the case when cutting moldings. After all the various pieces of moldings have been cut to size, I glue them and I nail some of them in place. I use as few nails as possible to make sure that everything is held in place until the glue dries. No, this is not a medieval torture device. It's called a miter clamp. It helps pinch outside miter joints together with just enough clamping force to ensure that the joint doesn't open up in the future. And if you're worried about the dimples left behind, the points are actually so sharp that it's really a non-issue. Normally primer takes care of it. And by the way, if I ever start a heavy metal band, I'll name it Medieval Torture Device. Here's the profile I'm going to add to the underside of the top. And I do this in 2 passes. The last pass is very light to help achieve the best cut quality possible. Now it's time to install the crown molding. Dun dun dun. When installing crown molding, two angles need to be accounted for, the spring angle and the miter angle. This stop system that I built into my miter saw station holds the crown at the proper spring angle, which means all I need to worry about is the miter angle. My first move is to cut two pieces with opposing angles. Then I take them to the project and check the fit. In this case, as with everything I do, the fit is absolutely unequivocally perfect the first time. But I cut them long enough to where if a little adjustment needed to be made, the pieces would still be long enough to be useful. But I've never needed to do that. Once I'm happy with the setup, I always cut the longest pieces first, so that if I cut one wrong, I still have a chance to cut that piece out of another piece of molding. Then the miscut piece gets broken down into the smaller pieces of the project. But I've never needed to do that either. Pin nails, miter clamps, and glue are the order of the day, and I put glue in the miter joint itself as well as on the top and bottom edge of the piece of crown molding just to help hold everything in place. After I'm done practicing my sweet bow staff skills, I get back to work installing this panel molding. A great way to make adjustments to small molding profiles is to use a disc sander. It's very controlled and it's easy to sneak up to a marked line. Pro tip though, if you're going to use this method, 120 grit is too fine. It burns too quickly. Go for 80 grit. Unfortunately, I bought a 10-pack of 120 grit discs, which is like a 5-year supply, and don't suggest that I throw them out. I'm too cheap for that. Last but not least, this is called a cloverleaf molding, and I just use it to break up this flat surface across the front of the mantle. Now's as good a time as any for a song recommendation. Recently, Eddie Van Halen passed away. So in his memory, I suggest the Van Halen song Jump. When making song recommendations, I don't normally like to go for the obvious songs we've all heard a million times. But for me, that song sums up Van Halen so well. It's a fun song, and watching Van Halen play, they always looked like they were having a blast. In my opinion, there's nothing more compelling than watching someone do something at a very high level and enjoy themselves at the same time. I think Jump is a great example of that. I always find it easier to just let the moldings run wild and come back and trim them later. This way, I only have to worry about cutting the one side accurately. Finishing up a few small details, this covers the reason why earlier I wanted these moldings to be attached really well. I put in some blocking down there, but still, this piece does attach to the moldings. Here it is all mocked up. Next up, take it apart and off for primer and paint. After disassembling the mantle, the next step is primer, and the primer and painting process can really make or break a project. I've seen plenty of projects that were really well designed and well built, but the finish applied looked like 80 miles of bad road. Spray finishing can really take a good project and make it a great one. So the next couple of minutes will be a brief look at the way I spray finish. Let's start with a look at one of my favorite spray guns, the Harbor Freight Super Secret Special HVLP spray gun. These go for about 10 or 15 bucks depending on if they're on sale or not. It's gravity fed, meaning the fluid comes down from the cup on top of the gun and is mixed with air that's coming up the handle. This type of gun isn't great at spraying really heavy or thick coatings unless those coatings can be thinned down enough to flow through the passages within the gun. I use this gun for primer because primers can normally be thinned down with minimal negative side effects. After 2 back-to-back coats of primer, I give all surfaces a quick sanding. I do this to knock down any minor imperfections as well as to add some tooth for the top coat to bite onto. I add a little caulking as needed as well. Most modern water-based coatings bond mechanically to the surface they're being applied to. There's no chemical bond. Sanding roughens up a surface and gives the finish something to hold on to. This is known as tooth. But sanding dust can greatly reduce that bond. I always wipe off all surfaces with water to make sure there's no dust. I'm using a black rag here for dramatic effect. I like to use Cabinet Coat for trim and built-in projects. It's a urethane blend, so it dries hard versus the sticky feeling that seems to come along with latex paints. This is a model 2001 Binks conventional spray gun with a CA Technologies pressurized cup. This is a conventional spray gun, not HVLP. Conventional spray guns run at a higher PSI, which helps atomize heavier, thicker water-based coatings, and the pressurized cup helps push those coatings through the passages in the gun. The end result is a spray gun that sprays a nice finish and does it very fast. I keep a couple ready for action at any given time, and I keep a few older ones around for spare parts. I have a 60-gallon air compressor that supplies air to this gizmo here. This is a filter which removes water and oil. Those are the two nasties that air compressors can put into compressed air. It also has a regulator to control pressure to the spray gun. This thing works flawlessly. The downside is it uses up filters pretty quickly, and they're not inexpensive. But for how good it works, I think it's worth it. For whatever reason, this warning label cracks me up. I always run my material through a strainer. This reduces the amount of little chunks that spatter out across my workpiece, and also the amount of 4-letter words I spatter out from my chew hole. I also like to thin the material with mountain spring water. It seems to work much better than desert oasis water. For my tastes, I've thinned enough when, as the material is dripping off the end of the stir stick, it doesn't leave a visible mark on the surface. Hope that makes sense. Once the spray gun and material are set up, the rest is easy. For projects like this, I use a fairly narrow spray pattern. This allows me to spray more passes at different angles to lay paint onto all the different surfaces of the moldings. For bigger projects, I open the fan up wider. While spraying, there's really only 3 possible outcomes. Too much, too little, or just the right amount of paint hits the surface. Too much and the paint will drip. Not enough, and the little dots of paint won't connect to form into one continuous layer. This is a feel thing, and it kind of depends on a bunch of factors: spray gun setup, material, temperature, day of the week, what you ate for lunch, and so on. I always do a test piece just to get my sense of normal before moving to the main event. For whatever reason, I forgot to install the mounting system earlier, so once the paint was dry, I installed a French cleat. My excellent penmanship is indicating that I used a 15-degree angle. Installation is the final phase of this glorious mantle project. Luckily, my beautifully bearded buddy Josh was kind enough to lend a hand with this laborious task. The French cleat really makes installation a snap. Once a center line has been established, I measure and mark where the female half of the French cleat needs to be mounted, and I mark for level. Then I add left and right cleats. After that, it's a simple matter of horsing the mantle in place, even if it resists. Here's the reason why I leave the shoes off until installation day. It's a great place to hide a screw. It also allows for a little up and down play, which in just another second I'll show how for this particular project was very helpful. Okay, so whoever ordered the hearth ordered it about a foot too short. The new one is on order, but as they say in the construction industry, the show must go on. I left the shoes off so that the stone guys can slide the hearth underneath and then glue the shoes in place once the stone is positioned. And speaking of stone, stack stone is going around the fireplace as well as above the mantle. Here's how I left it. The space is ready for the other contractors to come in and do their work. I just love these small molding details. I think the end result turned out great, or as my grandma used to say, it looks smart. This really was a fun project. I always enjoy building mantles, and I hope you enjoyed following along. Thanks for watching. Till next time.